Washington Journal continues.
And now joining us on the Washington Journal is a guest we've had on relatively frequently. This is Linda Robinson of the RAND Corporation. She's also an author, and she's covered a lot of military campaigns. Linda Robinson, where were you last?
Well, I think we're going to talk about ISIL today, so I have been out in the region this year. I've been to Iraq and Jordan and Kuwait. And in Iraq, I visited all of the various units that were doing the advisory and training work out there.
Now, are you working with the Pentagon in your current role?
So RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution. It works for anyone, but I would say probably the bulk of its work is for the U.S. government, and of that, the biggest part is DoD research.
So when you're out in the field, do you get a sense of who's fighting who's winning?
It's so complex, so I think that's very important to establish. It is, in my view, we've had a number of Iraqi units over the past year that we've been able, the U.S. military has re-engaged with and is starting to understand their exact state, because there was a loss of visibility of who was leading these units, what their capability was, what kind of equipment they had, and it runs the gamut. The best out there are the Iraqi Special Operations Forces. They're called the Counterterrorism Service, and I actually watched that unit grow up over my many visits from my time as a reporter, 2003 through 2008, and they became the most proficient unit, and they still are. They've been in every battle. They've suffered a lot of losses. They need a lot of equipment. So that's the high end. The low end are units that completely disintegrated in the Iraqi army. And then there are the Kurdish forces, which they're kind of a militia. They have a less formal organization, but they do also have special forces units that the U.S. military has been closely engaged with, again, heavily through that 2003, 2008, 2010 period. And we're re-engaged again with those. And I think that is really where the main hope rests right now. But because you need a hold force, as they say, you need units, enough mass of indigenous forces to be on keeping the peace after a clearing operation. So it's very important to be working with the full gamut of units, and we can talk more about the Shia militias and the Sunni tribal forces as we go forward. But obviously they're trying to develop the Sunni tribal forces as a hold force in conjunction with the Iraqi government. And then Syria, of course, is a whole different stew of groups that we're working with, and we can talk about that.
Well, Linda Robinson, we're going to put a map up, and if you could explain, looking at this map, where U.S. forces might be. And it's a map of Iraq, but it shows the surrounding area as well, and they'll put it in this in your monitor over here, but you can see it right over here as well.
Right.
There, it's in the
Shall
monitor.
I look at which monitor
you can just
here?
go right ahead and look at that one.
Okay, good. Yes, well, it is the U.S. advisory role, and I should just maybe throw out a few facts here. There have been about 3,500 U.S. military in Iraq over the past year. And that includes special operations forces, conventional military, and then there are another couple thousand coalition partners also doing three things basically. Train and equip on 6 sites. Most of them are around Baghdad, but also up in Erbil, in the Kurdistan region in the north, and out in Anbar in the west. Otherwise, they're clustered in bases around the greater Baghdad area. Then there is the advisory mission, and this is where the Special Operations Forces have been heavily devoted, and that is with the units I mentioned, the Kurdish and Iraqi, Arab Iraqi, I shouldn't even say that, the CTS, the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, is a very mixed unit. A lot of times people just assume that things are broken down into the various sects. This is the one unit in Iraq that has the full complement of Shia, Sunni, and Kurd. And that's why I've paid a lot of attention to what that unit's able to do. And so our Special Operations Forces and Coalition Special Operations Forces have been out advising, but they've been very restricted in where they've been able to be and what they've been able to do. And I would characterize the advisory mission largely as having occurred up at the headquarters level. And the debate has been, and a lot of people in the field have been pushing to get the advisory mission happening at lower levels, brigade level and below. And this is very important because you need advisors from the Ministry of Defense level all the way down to the field, and in order to have that full effect on the unit. And they're doing things, a lot of the debate here in the U.S. has revolved, I think, unfortunately, around the use of joint terminal air controllers, JTACs, those guys on the ground that we put out there to call in airstrikes. And that's just one element of an advisory mission. So it's very important, I think, for people to learn a little bit more about the full spectrum of advisory roles. And that, I think, is where we're headed now, is to expanding that. There's also, I think, a new use that's being authorized by the U.S. government to have the troops out in a combat role. And I think it will just be this Special Operations Expeditionary Force that Secretary Carter talked about in his testimony just a few days ago.
How quickly will those troops be added to what's already over there?
The exact date isn't known, just as the 50 that have been authorized to go into Syria. We don't know when they're actually going to get on the ground, but it will be soon. I think what you have heard consistently from both Secretary Carter and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, is the need to accelerate and intensify. And especially, of course, in the wake of Paris, the Paris attacks. Now I think the world's attention is riveted on the ISIL problem. So I think you'll see them in certainly a matter of weeks, maybe a matter of days. But I do think it's important, while we're entering a new phase now, to point out that these Special Operations Forces have been there for a year, working in these various ways. And the emblematic raid that people have mentioned is the Abu Sayyaf raid into Syria, which Special Operations Forces conducted. They wound up killing Abu Sayyaf rather than capturing him, but they did capture his wife and a huge trove of intelligence information. And that's the key reason for these raids, is they are going to yield a trove of intelligence and hopefully captured ISIL members that can then be interrogated, and that is going to greatly expand the knowledge of who's doing what in that network and allow that targeting. Hopefully something on the scale or rapidity of what was being done in Iraq during the days of the surge, where you got a huge effect on the network by having multiple raids a night and having this information come in, and before it gets cold, people are moving on it. Now in Iraq, they're going to do this in conjunction with these Iraqi Special Operations Forces that I've mentioned. So they're not doing unilateral raids in Iraq. That's the agreement with the Iraqi government. In Syria, they'll be doing unilateral. And I should say, though, when it's a case of a U.S. hostage, they will obviously always reserve the right to do a unilateral mission.
Linda Robinson is our guest, and we are talking about U.S. strategy, more troops into the Iraqi region to fight ISIS, ISIL, however you want to refer to it. Numbers are on the screen if you want to participate in this conversation. And Sam in Manassas, Virginia, Republican line, you're first up.
Yes, good morning. Let me say this. First of all, we could get rid of ISIS in one day. If Truman and Ike was alive, they would drop atomic weapon on that city, Raqqa. That would be it. Boko Haram, when they kidnap and keep raping all these people, when they run through the woods, napalm them. We did that in Vietnam. Let me say this also. The reason why we don't do this, or we don't get rid of these people, because then we have, who are we going to fight? We got a $700 billion military budget. We need to keep that up. Also, you need 500,000 soldiers. If you didn't fight these people, then you wouldn't need all this.
All right, I think we got the point, Sam. Were you able to hear
Yes.
that, Linda Robinson?
Yes,
he
I
says
was.
we could handle this in one day.
Yes.
or in a short period of time?
Well, I think this is a very important point. Obviously, the U.S. has a tremendous amount of firepower, and we have been conducting an air war. I didn't mention that, and we can talk about that more. What you achieve from the air is physical destruction, and if you don't have the rules of engagement that have been applied, you can have mass civilian casualties, and those things can create their own problems. But there's also this central question of then what? Who is going to come along behind to guarantee the peace and ensure that these areas don't become a terrorist sanctuary again the minute that you leave or stop bombing? And that's why this approach is being taken, to really work through indigenous forces in Iraq and in Syria so that you have an end game. And I think this is why there's a lot of disappointment about U.S. military activities over the past year. The end game can take a long while. It can take a generation to work with these forces and build enough competency there so that they can do it. But I think there is a great deal of frustration in the wake certainly of the various terrorist attacks that have occurred, Paris being the most notable, but also we had the Russian jet shot down in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So I think there's a desire right now to just quickly finish the problem. The ISIL or ISIS, and I do use ISIL because that's the U.S. government's term, but Islamic State is the group's own term for itself. They are heavily dug in. They have fortified these cities that they have been holding now for well over a year. Raqqa, Ramadi, Mosul. These are going to take a long time to recapture and, most importantly, hold with capable ground forces.
Charles, Mount Orab, Ohio, Independent Line, please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. I find it amazing that even the guest that you have on will not call what happened in Santa Barbara a terrorist attack. Those people didn't do that on the spur of the moment.
Well, you know what, Charles? I'm going to have to move on because we're done talking about what happened in San Bernardino, and we've moved on. We're talking about the current U.S. policy towards Syria and Iraq and possibly more troops headed over there. Linda Robinson, when you hear the term boots on the ground, when people say we need boots on the ground or we don't need boots on the ground, what does that mean to you? We've got 3,500 people over there. Already, we're sending another 6,500 over.
Yes, I am delighted that you brought this up because this has bothered me from the beginning when this term was used. It's a vague term that only creates confusion. It's very, very harmful to any public understanding and debate about what we're doing. The boots on the ground, of course, as you say, we've had 3,500 advisors over there. They all have boots on. They're all U.S. military in uniform, and I would say the majority of them are combat arms and infantrymen. So if you were to employ them in a combat mode, they would be combat troops, but they are all qualified to conduct combat. Now, I think, as I listened to the debate over the authorization for the use of military force and read all the congressional testimony over the past year, I believe the administration employed that term to mean it was not going to countenance any option of sending large combat formations, brigades, divisions, corps over to fight in the front of, that they were not going to take the leading role in combat. We've crossed the line now, I think, into combat, and of course there was the first combat death with the U.S. Special Operations Forces participating with the Kurdish Special Operations Forces in the raid on Hawija, a prison in Hawija, to free the captives there. And the Delta soldier died in coming forward to help the Kurds who were bogged down. That was not a planned activity, but that crossed the line, and we're now in a combat mode. But what I believe the administration intends is to remain keeping the Iraqi and Syrians in the lead, but in these raids, the U.S. Special Operations Forces are going to be allowed to participate in combat if and as needed. The more competent the ground force is, the Iraqi or Syrian forces, the less the U.S. force is needed. And I should point out, this counterterrorism service that I mentioned, the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, they have 14 JTACs. They do have people able to direct airstrikes. They're not as proficient. The use of the English language is very important. That's the language of air power. So you do need to have kind of a combined effort at this stage. But the emphasis is on growing that capability of the Iraqis.
Next call for Linda Robinson of RAND comes from Mike in Buena Vista, Virginia. Republican Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, the policies that she's talking about, I mean, it's more or less where everything's working well and everything else. The gun laws here, the first thing, and I know you don't want to talk about the shootings, but it is related. When us in the United States see that not much is being done about ISIS, and they're not going to vet. I talked to the guy yesterday on C-SPAN, and more or less he voted that bill down to vet these people. What is a United States citizen supposed to do? My daughter now wants a gun for her birthday. For Christmas.
Any response for that caller, Linda Robinson?
Well, I would say I think the Paris attacks have evoked a fear, and it is a real fear that ISIL is now moving into a phase of focusing more on external attacks than attacks in Iraq and Syria. My view of them is they shift. They will attack where expedient, and we've seen that within Iraq over the past year. When they were attacked into Crete, they didn't stand and fight. They melted away, and they began attacking Ramadi. So they are very agile, and they're going to shift. But I think the way I look at the policy options is there are three options. Containment, which is really standing off and using air power and not getting involved. There is the current approach, which is relying on and building partner forces on the ground. And then there's a large-scale U.S. direct military intervention that I believe there is very little support for among either party to go in and do that. But there is agreement that you've got to deal with the Iraq-Syria problem and the amount of territory they're holding, because that's really the central base from which all of this emanates and where most of the foreign fighters are gravitating to.
Sean, Summerland, Key, Florida, independent line, more U.S. troops to the Middle East. What do you think?
Good morning. Let's be realistic about this. This entire discussion and our actions are predicated on a fallacious premise. That premise is that we originally went in to get the weapons of mass destruction. There were no such things. All of the actions that have been created since then have been destructive. They've been ruinous for the nation in so many fashions, and the death of so many of our citizens. And here we go again, stepping into a place where we have no business being, making mistakes that are going to lead to further mistakes down the road. What is necessary is for us to take a brave step and step out of there. Where there's the need for humanitarian help, we are there to protect and to help as much as we can. But we have no business being there. We are there because we made mistakes. And this is not going to end. And this intellectual discussion about how many troops are going to send, what kind of troops are going to send, again, is all predicated on a fallacious premise. So
that's Sean in Summerland, Key, Florida. Linda Robinson.
Thank you. Yes, well, and certainly those with long memories, as this caller certainly has, the original sin, if you will, of the invasion in Iraq in 2003 was this premise that there were weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be incorrect. And time has passed now, and we did fight a very large war there. We withdrew. ISIL rose up out of the ashes of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it now holds more territory with more people, more guns, more capability than anything, frankly, we've ever seen. I would say, I think, in reaction to what the caller said, I think that there's been an effort, but probably not a sufficient effort, to ask the Arab countries to do more, because they do. Those surrounding countries have the greater interest. And you see, for example, Saudi Arabia has been very preoccupied by its own military operation in Yemen, which is on its peninsula and is directly south. And granted, it's very concerned about what's going on there. But Saudi Arabia is the big dog in the Arab Middle East and needs to be doing more. It finally opened an embassy in Baghdad after many years. They've been holding the Baghdad government at arm's length, and it's very important, I think, for the Arab world to step up. Likewise, we've had difficulty with Turkey, which is the main route for foreign fighters and materiel and the oil smuggling into Syria. So the engine of ISIL passes through Turkey. And there's been a consistent effort to try to get more cooperation from these countries, and much more needs to be done. The more they do, the less the U.S. and the European and other allies need to do. But I think everyone's galvanized right now by the idea that this group, left alone, is not going to do anything but get bigger and conduct more attacks. So the question is, what's an effective attack? And if I could just say, in response to that previous caller, I view our effort over the last year as insufficient. I don't think it's the wrong approach, but I think the advisors were too restricted. They were restricted to a very few areas. They weren't able to touch all of the units. They've had to be very sequestered away from the Shia militias. The Shia militias are a big player in Iraq, and we need to recognize that fact and cope with it. There's also been a very slow equipment pipeline. This equipment has to be delivered much more quickly. They need Humvees, they need anti-tank weapons, they need secure radios, they've just now delivered line charges because the ISIL units are ringing these cities with multiple IEDs. They're using massive IED vehicles as attack weapons. There's a real need to speed up the materiel, and the U.S. system has been far too slow. The production line of Humvees in this country is back at a peacetime level. So these are all things that the Department of Defense needs to focus on and make the system work. They did it earlier in the early days of the Iraq War when there were no, the MRAPs, do you remember the armored personnel vehicles? There weren't enough. They were bolting on armor to Humvees to try to survive these massive bombs. So there are a whole series of things that need to be done to make this effort effective. And it's not just a matter of sending a few hundred or thousand more, although I do think more advisors, but more importantly, distributed widely, geographically, and distributed throughout the units that we are trying to support.
Linda Robinson, what do you think about the narrative that the Iraq War is the direct cause of what we're facing today?
Well, you know, so Iraq was being governed by a dictator, Saddam Hussein, who invaded the neighboring country, Kuwait. We went in Desert Storm, pushed the Saddam Hussein army out of there, contained him, if you will, through a no-fly zone, sort of suppressing the threat. At some point, that was probably a dictatorship that was going to end in one form or another. And when that did, of course, the Shia majority are going to take control of that country. So we've been involved in a very long-running process of change in Iraq. And many people just assume it's going to fly apart into three parts, Kurd, Shia, and Sunni. The Kurdistan region will probably eventually become independent, but I think the question is still open. What kind of new national identity will Iraqis, Shia and Sunni, form? The only path to a stable Iraq that I see is eventually another autonomous province or set of provinces of the Sunni areas in the north and west. But that takes a long time. There's a lot of mistrust and grievance there, and we of course want it to be over. We may assume responsibility for having exacerbated it, which I think is a very fair critique, but nonetheless it's the drama of that country, and history only moves at a certain pace. We could do things to make it worse, and I believe that more active diplomatic engagement might help. We sometimes say, well, the Iranians are in charge now, they have so much influence, but we're not even competing in the influence game, in my view, with more support, more equipment, more presence there in ways that the Iraqi government wants, which they have been asking for our help. I think that would gain more influence to help some of these things happen.
Gary, Connorsville, Indiana, Democratic line. Thanks for holding. You're on with Linda Robinson of RAND.
Hello, sir, and hello, ma'am. A young man called a short while ago named Sam, I believe, and he touched up on something that I agree with. We seem to be him-hawing around too much about what we're supposed to be doing. If they say, if we're going to fight a damn war, fight it with a determined resolve, okay? Not screw around about it. And he said something about the military budget, which I believe is beside the point. It's about protecting our collective livelihood and our rights as a nation. And so, and I believe a lot of times when we make these decisions, I don't think we think them through necessarily not all the way through. And I just think we need to make sure we are doing the right thing, and then when we do it 100%. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think obviously everyone tries to make the right decisions, but we can't always understand the effects of our actions. I would share a critique, I think, that the caller is making, that what has been done over the last year, really until just a few weeks ago, has been too minimal, but also as changes have been made, they've been very incremental. For example, just when I was in Iraq, a decision was finally made to send a few advisors out to a base called Takadam in Anbar. And that people had been agitating for this within the U.S. military for quite a while, to get these advisors more distributed so they could get in contact with these units, understand how they worked, what they needed, start advising them, start coordinating them. And that was a very slow decision in coming. And I'm concerned now that even though a series of decisions have apparently been taken, it's important that they not be incremental. I think it is important to remedy the insufficiency, get enough people out there in enough places, but not ricochet off into a major combat role, because I do think the long-term effects of that, it creates dependency, it may create more recruitment of ISIL fighters. It again gets the U.S. into a combat mode where it's leading, and whenever the U.S. gets into the lead, it tends to be the type A personality, and it doesn't let the host country partner come along and do what it needs to do to develop its own capability.
Candy is in Clear Lake, Iowa. Republican. Candy, go ahead.
Well, I'm an independent. I dialed the wrong number. Okay, here's my comment. We sent people, money, and equipment. A bunch of the money, the equipment, got turned over to the exact people we don't want to have it. We know they have a magazine. They have a warehouse full of antiquities. We tried surgical intervention, and unfortunately, as much as I would like a diplomatic solution with the host country stepping up and doing their job on their own land, it's time for the allies with us in the lead, because we're always responsible for everybody's problem, to just knock it off, burn it down, and start over. Why have a prolonged World War III when we don't have to?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the answer is what happens next, because you can go in big and heavy, you can burn it down, as the caller said, but there's still going to be a country there, and the question of who secures it and who governs it remains. And I think having a far-sighted approach is important. That said, and I'm worried that the current approach has been discredited because it has been so minimally applied. I think that I'm kind of in the Goldilocks position here. There's something between what we've been doing and a full-bore onslaught that the U.S. Opens up its guns, levels entire cities, which we did do in Kobani in Syria, and Sinjar, the most recent town, was pretty much leveled. So I think it's very important to consider the impact and the costs of rebuilding this country as the war goes forward. But a greater intensification, I think, is at least worth trying. I frankly do not think that a large-scale combat deployment, we're talking 100,000 troops, those kinds of numbers, I think they could have more negative effects than positive.
From the New York Times this morning, Linda Robinson, Kerry urges deft removal of Assad to crush ISIS. Secretary Kerry said Thursday he believes that if an agreement can be reached to ease President Assad of Syria from power, a coalition of Americans, Russians, and Syrian forces could wipe out the Islamic State in a matter of literally months.
We've been talking mostly about Iraq, and of course that is hideously complex. Syria is even more complex, and what's going on there really are two wars. There is the ISIS war, if you will, in the eastern part of the country. We don't have a map up, but ISIS self-declared capital is Raqqa in the eastern part. And what has been happening over the past year is the Syrian Kurds primarily have been able to squeeze down that territory that ISIS holds, but it is still largely in charge. It's not a very populated area, but it has a lot of oil.
And
so
that's in the Iraqi border area, correct?
That's right. And if you look at Syria there, I guess we don't have as much. It is in the green area. There we go. So if you just look at the right-hand half, roughly, that is ISIL territory, with the Syrian Kurds up on the northern part on the border with Turkey, and they've been gaining territory and starting to close off that border with Turkey, although there's still, I think it's about 45 miles, 98 kilometers, still in the hands of ISIS. So they still have a conduit to and from Turkey. Then, and just to shift to your question about what Secretary Kerry's trying to do, over in the western half of the country, that is where most of the population is. The regime of Assad, Bashar al-Assad, has been in power, and it was one of those Arab Spring countries where people rose up against him, and he began crushing them brutally. And there are 250,000 people, Syrians, are now dead. And of course, it's the source of most of the refugee crisis that Europe is suffering. So Secretary Kerry has, I think, admirably launched a diplomatic effort to try to get the various countries involved in this complicated war to come together around a scheme that will plot a transition for Assad to leave. This has been a long-standing desire to have Assad leave, have a diplomatic resolution, get a new government, and then focus everyone's attention on attacking ISIL. The problem is a lot of the Arab countries and Turkey are more interested in fighting Assad and getting Assad out. And of course, the Syrian people are very focused on Assad. And then of course, we had the Russian intervention there, which is shocking, and now it's further complicated the situation. Russia has always had a base in Tartus there on the Mediterranean coast. It's not a very robust base. It's basically been a naval resupply facility, but they used that. They brought in massive air power, air defense, some ground troops, and because they saw Assad starting to wobble because of the gains of these groups over the last year, and mostly the Islamic extremist groups are the ones that have been gaining, because once again we have been very minimalist in the support we've been willing to provide to people fighting Assad. So now the question is whether Russia, in the wake of the attack on its people, the Russian jet bombing in Egypt, is going to make Putin, the Russian president, a partner in the fight against ISIL. Right now, he has been bombing the Syrian opposition aimed at Assad. He is trying to shore up Assad, protect the Tartus base, and reinforce Assad's grip on the country, which I think is a futile effort, because Assad has virtually no army left. He has been mostly supported by Iranian-led militias, Iraqi militias, and Lebanese Hezbollah. So it is a question in my mind whether Russia is there indefinitely to prop up a regime that has no popular support and very little wherewithal to sustain itself, similarly to Iran? Or are they ready to join a diplomatic effort to arrange a transition to the country and start fighting ISIL? Now, some people are willing for Russia to just join in the bombing campaign, let them continue to do what they're doing in the western Syria. But I would say, first, we haven't seen Russia bomb very much at all of the ISIL facilities, but they're also using dumb bombs. So we have precision bombs. Britain just joined the air campaign 2 days ago in Syria. France is involved. We have high-tech equipment and high-tech allies. So frankly, I don't think that Russia is the game changer for ISIL in Syria.
Linda Robinson's most recent book, 100 Victories, Special Ops, and the Future of American Warfare. Next call for her comes from Rachel in Forney, Texas, Independent Line.
Yes. You know, a lot of people believe that ISIS sprang up when Obama pulled out our troops out of Iraq. But, you know, we all knew that that didn't happen just all of a sudden. It happened right when we got into Iraq. They was already over there, and we trained them. And I knew that there's something going on because Bush, they decided to surge because they knew they was over their heads. They knew that there was a bigger problem than they thought it was. And we train these people. But it upsets me when we're having people attack us, and people are going around talking about how weak our president is. It does not make us look good, and it makes them want to come over and attack us. And the gun
You know
thing,
what, Rachel, we're going to leave it right there. With all these interrelationships, are there ISIL fighters that were at one point U.S. allies? Much like the Sunnis are now U.S. allies, but weren't at one
No,
point.
in fact, a lot of the ISIL leadership was detained by the U.S. Army back when it was in Iraq. So it is certainly true that ISIL grew out of the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which sprang up. It was very largely Sunni and Ba'athist, but it had a heavy component. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was the leader, come from Jordan. So it's a blend of radical jihadist fighters that are both Iraqi and also foreign. Now, the new estimates are about 30,000 foreign fighters have flocked to this movement, which really has become a movement. But the core leadership remains Iraqi, and many of them were former Sunni Ba'athists. So Saddam Hussein's people, so they're very trained. They have military intelligence, organizational skills, part of what's making this group so hard. But when we came in and toppled Saddam, they actually went into the opposition. Many people wonder, of course, if there was a different path. Had we had a different strategy with regard to the Ba'athists and Saddam's army, might we have forestalled this entire development? You know, the might have beens are many in this history.
Philip, Warner Robins, Georgia, Republican. Hi, Philip.
Hey, how you doing?
Please go ahead.
I have a bit of a couple of questions for Linda. In history, how many air campaigns have ever won a war?
And
then,
go ahead. And why do you ask that question, Philip?
Well, because it's been brought out heavily that we're launching all kinds of airstrikes, and we're sending in 30 more guys, special forces, 30 more guys, just 30 people. And how many special forces have ever won a war?
So given your rhetorical questions, and we'll get an answer to those, but given that rhetorical question that you asked, what do you want to say? What is your point?
My point is, it takes an army to defeat an army.
Great, we got it.
Great. No, they're very good points. And I hope nothing I said implied that I think we could win this by air power alone, because we certainly can't. Air power has degraded some of the capabilities over and assisted the ground forces, but it has been very constrained. And the opening of Incirlik base in Turkey to bombers, to coalition and U.S. bombers, is huge, because that's radically cut down the time. I would not minimize the role of air power, but it alone does not win any war. And I think that's a general, I mean, there are some air power advocates that think that you can win wars by air, but I think there's a large literature and evidence against that. But I think it is very important to know that it's one component of the strategy going forward.
And Cordell in Kansas City, Kansas, Democrat, you were the last call.
Ms. Robinson?
Yes.
Yes, I want to ask you two questions. The people that's coming over here, especially the men, why come the men can't stay there and fight for their homes? The second question is, when Obama, they was talking about sending their men home, which was the people in the United States said, bring our troops home. And they keep on blaming him for bringing the troops home. We wanted our troops to come home. And why come the men just can't stay there and fight for their own country? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think that you are correct. Certainly, President Obama campaigned on ending the wars, and it's been very important to him to bring U.S. service people home. And I have been in Iraq, 18 visits to Iraq over the years. There are Iraqis that want to fight. for their country, and they need support from their own government to do so, and they need support from other countries to do so. I think your question, though, also involves the refugee population, and of course, we've seen in Syria particularly just utter devastation through indiscriminate bombing that has led to the massive internal displacement and external displacement. I think 11 million is the figure, so it's one of the worst refugee crises we've ever seen. And so I think that in the face of those kinds of tactics, you do have to understand why many people would choose to flee. But again, we've also had, I think, willing Syrians. The problem with our effort to recruit Syrians to fight was we wanted them only to fight ISIL. And so very few came forward in that train and equip program because they want to get rid of Assad. And some of them were willing to fight both, but we had a litmus test that excluded people that said they were going to go and fight Assad. And I think that was just setting up an impossible test. And I think you would have had more people fighting if you were willing to say, let's have some kind of concerted approach to this problem.
France, Britain, other Middle East countries fighting in this area. How much of a muddle is this, or is it pretty clear-cut?
Well, there are 65 countries in the coalition, but really only 24, I would say, on doing actual things with this problem we've been talking about, and then a smaller subset of that conducting airstrikes or sending trainers and advisors in. But there is a substantial number. I think the big gap, though, is Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, frankly. What are they willing to do? We've been waiting on Turkey, which presumably was going to try to seal that border and possibly help protect any safe zone that might be created in Syria. There are a number of things that have been on the table. So I think there's a possibility of some of these allies to step up. And I think, of course, in the information campaign and the recruitment campaign to try to stem the recruitment of these would-be ISIL fighters, the Arab world, the Muslim world, but mostly the Arab Sunni world needs to grapple with that problem seriously. That's really the long game here.
Okay, final tweet. Wild and Wonderful says, okay, let's assume Assad is removed and ISIS defeated. To whom do we turn over power? Without that element in waiting, it's a waste.
Yes. That is also a very important question, and most people think a confederate formulation is most likely to emerge if Syria remains as an intact state. You might have a bunch of microstates, as Yugoslavia, after the Balkan War, split up into a lot of small states. So I think the future is really unknown, but it's unlikely to come back, and certainly under the rule of a minority Shiite ruler.
Linda Robinson, RAND Corporation, as always, we appreciate your coming over, taking calls from our viewers. 2 more segments coming up today on the Washington Journal.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.